So our next keynote speaker is going to be Dr. David Stovall. Dr. Stovall is a professor in the Department of Black Studies in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice at the University of Illinois, Chicago. His scholarship investigates three areas: critical race theory, the relationship between housing and education, and the intersection of race, place, and school. In the attempt to bring theory to action, Dr. Stovall works with community organizations and schools to address issues of equity, justice, and abolishing the school-prison nexus. His work led him to become a member of the design team for the Greater Lawndale Little Village School for Social Justice, which opened in the fall of 2005. Furthering his work with communities, students, and teachers, his work manifests itself in his involvement with the People's Education Movement, a collection of classroom teachers, community members, students, and university professors in Chicago, Los Angeles, and in the San Francisco Bay Area, who all engage in collaboratively community projects centered in creating relevant curriculum. In addition to his duties and responsibilities as a professor at UIC, he also serves as a volunteer social studies teacher at the Greater Lawndale Little Village School for Social Justice from 2005 to 2018. And I think Dr. Stovall briefly stepped out. So we will pause for 1 minute, and I think he's coming back in. All right, let's give Dr. Stovall a round of applause. He is coming in. All right.
Should I take that one over?
You can take this.
Cool. What's happening, y'all? Everybody all right? Word. Thanks again for folks, Kenny Fasching Varner, for inviting somebody like myself to engage with you all, because I am much more used to being uninvited to stuff. So to be invited is always a gift. Now, what I want to do today is facilitate a conversation, right? Because in a lot of times, you all as folks who are preparing to be teachers, you all will be in these things called professional developments. And some of them will be damn shitty, right? I mean, they will be horrible, right? Some of you all have already been in schoolhouses and seen it. You know, you got visions of ripping off one arm, beating yourself with the other one, jumping out of windows. You know, that's always the thing that was with me as a high school teacher. I would always, like, one of the professional developments they had, and the person was talking, the first thing I said was, this is not going to work. In fact, not only is it not going to work, it's going to be horrible. And in fact, I'm not going to do it, right? So now I think it's important for us to engage. What does it mean to operate with a politic of refusal while you are actually in a fight? Now, that's, again, I don't want to spew this kind of toxic masculine stuff out here, but I think about a fight in a very different way. The fight is actually against your humanity and your profession, because there are a bunch of people who are telling teachers what to do who do not know shit about teaching, right? And we just have to be clear about that. And that's why it sounds so wild to you all, because you're just kind of like, no, man, it's not going to work, man. What are we doing, right? And now you have to think about what it means to be in solidarity with your students in this space, right? Because when your students, y'all ever seen that cold stare that students give you, that young folks give you, and they just looking like, come on, man, there's got to be a better way. There has to, I just believe that there has to be something different. I refuse to engage in this, right? And we actually destroy the genius of young people through a lot of formal order and compliance. So now, when you think about an attack on critical race theory or an attack, because this is what the attack really is on. The attack is on naming what the United States is. Just simple, right? I mean, the train has left the station on this, y'all. The United States is a land founded on genocide, slavery, and wrongful land appropriation. Period. Like, we don't have to go into a big debate about that. White folks told on themselves, right? I mean, it's called the Constitution, right? That's what the 3/5 clause is, right? 3/5 clause said, look, you know, certain folks can vote. Certain folks are counted as 3/5 of a human being because in the state of South Carolina, there are a lot of black folks who own property. So if they voted, they could take over the state of South Carolina. That's what it was. Thomas Jefferson had 6 babies by Sally Henning. 6 of them. And we can't talk about 1. So now, what is it that we're in? A good friend of mine always equates this to fighting in a phone booth. Now, if you think about, you know, your experience as a young person, you know, some of y'all got into some fights, right? Some of those fights, you did not win, right? So think about that rough fight, but do it in 4 square feet. And that's what's happening to us now, right? And I think we have to be honest about this. And when we're not honest about this, we become victimized by it. And I'm worried about that victimization. Clark County is short 838 teachers. What that meant is a whole lot of folks walked off the job. They're just like, look, this is just not worth my time or understanding, right? I don't feel protected. I don't feel appreciated, and I'm gonna move around, right? But here's the thing. A lot of those folks who left will never return to teaching. So we're in a moment, right? And I don't say this thing to you all to get everybody panic-stricken, but I say this to you all because we have to figure out what the fight will be. And it's gonna take some bravery, right? And we put a lot of burden on you all as emerging teachers without stepping up and figuring out how to support you. So now, when we start to think about this type of work, and we start to think about what it takes to do it, we have a heavy lesson from history that we often forget because in the United States, we are ahistorical. In fact, as a social studies educator, we have actually shifted social studies with the intent to bore you to death. Right? That's its purpose. So when you were falling asleep in social studies, that is what the creators meant to do. Because if I can continue to lie to you, you will reject it, but you're in a contained space and there's nothing else that you can do but go to sleep and never ask a question of your reality. So I've created a mechanism by which to lull you to sleep. Because if you never ask a question of your reality, you will continue to be victimized by it and you will never change the conditions that dehumanize you. Now, this gets me uninvited to a lot of stuff, right? I get a whole lot of Stovall. We just decided after further review, we're going in a different direction, right? And I'm like, you know, now I'm 50 now, so I'm like, shit, okay, look, cool, thank you, right? But for the folks who do invite me, I'm like, look, we gotta get into what this thing really is. Because if we're not talking about this, the silence becomes not only deafening, but it becomes confining, right? And a lot of folks feel shifted and in spaces where they do not feel like they know what to do, right? But the lessons of history bring us into a different understanding, right? Now, a couple examples. If we think about the Brown v. Board of Education decision, there's a ton of stuff that we don't talk about that happened during that. And folks like Vanessa Siddle Walker, folks like Jarvis Givens, folks like James Anderson, they let us know that something else was happening. Derek Bell talks about this also. And Derek Bell being one of the founders of critical race theory. Derek Bell talked about, during the Brown decision, he was one of the assistant attorneys for the Brown plaintiffs. And he said, much later in life, we ignored what black women were telling us. Black women specifically told us throughout the South, the issue was not sitting next to white kids in classrooms. The issue was to get the resources that were actually stolen from us. And if we got the resources that were stolen from us, we could do what we needed. And the NAACP Legal Defense Fund kept suing districts around integration without listening to what people actually needed. And now, when you come back to think about this, we got to ask a different question. I know this is kind of wild for you all as emerging teachers. There is this difference between schooling and education, and we don't talk about it. And I'm deeply concerned because as professors, we are the worst with this. I know some of you all have been in classes where a term is discussed, the professor never defines what the term is, and then asks you all to regurgitate it, and then you never have a real conversation. Give you an example of this. The word pedagogy. Right? Let's just talk about it how I go, right? Pedagogy. Why in the hell do you all never have a conversation about pedagogy? Y'all just use it all the time. Well, pedagogically, I was approaching this, pedagogically speaking, and no one has said what a pedagogy is. And we just expect y'all to use it all the time, right? Well, pedagogy is actually the practice. It is what you are actually doing, right? And the motivations behind it. So now, when we think about this in a particular way, it's pushing us to understand the work differently. So now you got to be clear around why you are in a classroom. And please do not answer me because I love the babies. I'm more concerned about what about if you don't? Right? Because the worst place you can be trying to collect a check is a schoolhouse. So now, when we start to think about this in different ways, it pushes on us because we now have to think about the why. Why are we actually doing this, right? For what purpose? And then we got to think about, dare we say, and I'm going to just give you all a context of this. Many of us would have at least one person that we would have described as a good teacher. Now, I want you to think about that person. Why was that person always in trouble? You gotta think about that. So that teacher who you connected with, there's a greater chance that they were always in trouble. Because they were not concerned with schooling. See, schooling is this order and compliance, right? It's when you got the little ones, everybody line up, right? I always look at the kindergarten line, and I always look at the one who's in the kindergarten line like, right? The kindergarten, like, everybody's lined up. I always look at the one who just walks away, like, right? Because that was me. I was like, what is this lining up stuff? What are we doing? For what? right? Because it was really introducing you to control, right? I remember one day I just wanted to dance. And me and a homie, I was like, we gonna dance. He was like, yup, let's get it cracking. And then I remember one of my classmates was like, I'm gonna tell on you. He was like, no, you're not. Right, but I got into some trouble for some other stuff, right? One day on the playground, I was just like, and some of y'all may have had this experience, I was like, you know what, we should just run. And, you know, the homie is like, where? I was like, I don't know, just someplace. Someplace has to be better than what it is that we're in now, right? And we just gonna run. It's like, how far are we gonna go? I do not know. We ain't got money. It does not matter. We gonna make it. We are 5 and we gonna make it work, right? So this thing around, we think about that, you know, we got slick language about this. We call this now oppositionally defiant behavior, right? We got slick labels for shit now, right? And what it really is telling us is that this is not working. And we are reminded all the time as young people that this was not intended to work. So now we're in a situation, and you all have had this experience, where education actually happens in spite of the schooling. Because the schooling is the order and compliance. Education is saying, I'm willing to work with others to change the condition because what it is that we're in is unacceptable. So now as a teacher, you have to begin to think about, how do I operate in solidarity with that understanding? How do I engage my content when the world is attacking me? Right? This is one of the most unusual times to enter the teaching profession in the history of the United States. Right? There are very few people who can speak to the type of attacks that teachers are experiencing that they've had in their teaching tenure. Very few. And those folks will go back to the 50s. So now, if we think about this in real time, how do you do that act of solidarity? Dave, we say that because, you know, in Clark County, you say solidarity, you know, the rando, whoever, pedagogy police might come and try to kick you out your classroom, right? What's the word wall? Solidarity. Right? Because that's what they do, right? Y'all seen those walkthroughs, right? What's on your word wall, right? Or, you know, you got your unit plans with students will be able to. The SWABOT, right? Y'all look at it, y'all look at all this stuff, y'all just look at it and be like, man, come on, man, what is this? Right, I was like, I used to write wild stuff on the SWABOT, but I was like, man, students will be able to recognize white supremacy and start a revolution tomorrow. Right, that's what students, if David Stovall is doing his job, that's what students are gonna be doing. Yeah, they're gonna be raising up every day and just being like, no, right? So now when we start to think about this, we have to wrestle with the mundane aspects of schooling and now think about how you actually get to education, right? Because that's some work, right? Teaching is going to make you come to grips with yourself. Right? You're gonna have some days where you just sitting in wherever you live just going like, shit, do I go tomorrow? I don't know, family. Like you kind of look, you look at your significant other, right? You look at the homies, y'all might have got together on the weekend. It's like, man, what you doing? Shit, I don't know, man. Right? It's real right now. Right? That was my first 3 years of teaching. Like every day, I was like, man, it's real right now. Like it's a whole. And the thing was, it had nothing to do with my students. Right? That was me, right? It was me asking a different question of myself because young people's bullshit meter is high. And the younger they are, it's even higher. Order and compliance lessens their bullshit meter. Because young ones, little ones, that's always like, man, look, anybody doing early childhood ed, blessings, because that is the foundation. Not in this hokey way, but young folks are very clear as to how they sense love. They know very clearly who loves them. They know very clearly who is meant to do them harm. They will show you in how they move. They will show you in their silence, and they will show you in who they talk to. Right? And the thing that we kill in schooling is our capacity to collaborate. Right? All the way down to the way folks sit. Right? Because, in kindergarten, you got a nap. I'm like, damn. Right? I remember I walked past the kindergarten classroom and I was like, oh, nap time, damn. I was like, man, I need one of them. Right? And then, you got all the little quick, good friend of mine's longtime kindergarten teacher. She does a little thing, crisscross applesauce, the whole little thing. The young folks get into their little space, story time, carpets, the whole thing. Right? But now, when we're thinking about this, it's going to become even more important to remember why you're in it, because this attack on you is constantly pushing you to question yourself with the hope that you will leave. Now, I get in trouble because there's a structural argument about you leaving. And you can look up a BBC video from about 10 years ago when Paul Vallis, who was the CEO at one time of Chicago Public Schools in the late 90s into the early 2000s, became the CEO of the New Orleans Charter District. And this was after Hurricane Katrina. And the BBC came, and the BBC is the British Broadcasting Network. I apologize for the acronym with no definition, right? So they come to interview Paul Vallis, and the reporter asks him, how are you all thinking about this in a way that is sustainable? And he said something that was very chilling, and I was surprised he said it publicly. He said, we do this with an understanding of a 10-year window. We do not expect any teacher in this district to last more than 10 years. Because if they last more than 10 years, it puts too much pressure on the pension system. So he literally named it. He said it flat out. This is what we do. So now you are in a space that is expecting you to leave. They just got a little funky because they didn't expect so many folks to leave at the same time. So now you're in this spot of fulfillment. Right? And fulfillment is an interesting word because fulfillment is actually a word that they use in factories. In Clark County, you have an Amazon what center? Fulfillment center. So now you have to think about this in a very different way. So now you got to dig a little deeper, right? And history is now telling us that we're part of a legacy of people who are also willing to fight. And in too many instances, when we are not fighting, we actually begin to internalize it and fight amongst ourselves. It's another tactic. And we got to be clear around what the interruption is. Now, history shows us that interruption. History tells us that there have been many teachers throughout the history of the United States that said that education is something different. Now, white supremacy will respond to education in a particular way. A good friend of mine, Christopher Spann, wrote a book about Mississippi during Reconstruction. There's an interesting data point, and this is how we have to understand what white supremacy really is. In the latter half of the 19th century, every county in Mississippi, two things happened. A church was burned and a school was burned to the ground. So now if we begin to think about this, those wonton attacks are akin to what we're seeing about critical race theory. And Dr. Lynn just explained to us what CRT is, but the folks who are the opponents haven't even read it. Like, anytime somebody is coming at you sideways about CRT, the first tool to use with them is to say, well, wait, how do you understand what it is? It's going to be a long moment of silence. And then you say, well, what do you want to be taught? Even longer silence. So now we're in this straw person argument. People who are, think about this. We're in a moment where people are opposing something that they don't even know what the hell it is. My guy's got a statement for that. That is bizarro world. Right? That is literally everything being turned upside down. Right? You're arguing about something that you don't know what it is, and now you're fearful of it because it's not CRT as much as it is the historical record, because people are mad that white kids get upset when they hear about things accurately. And that's the problem. And for me, I'm like, well, damn, y'all. Has anybody paid attention to the experiences of people of color in K-12 schools about feeling uncomfortable, marginalized, isolated? And we were getting lied to. So damn, the truth is gonna make you feel bad? Shit, what are we gonna do? Right? Because in schools, we get caught up in this. You get caught up in being nice. You know, you got it all through all the buildings, you know, work hard, be nice. You know, you got the posters of the babies, and then look, Jimmy is nice. Right? And y'all got all the little things. He plays with everyone. All right? And this is not a moment to be nice. It's a moment to fight. You are in a fight, if you want to believe me or not. It's like, look, I get on a plane tonight back to Chicago, right? You don't have to believe me, but I'm going to tell you this. You are in a situation where those folks are coming. It is not if, it is when. And you cannot be paranoid about this. I don't want y'all to come out the student center and be like, Stovall said we all gonna die. It's terrible. Y'all running down Flamingo in Maryland. It's all bad. Don't do it. Right? No. Mm-mm. The thing is, I want you to embrace it. If you embrace it, then you no longer fear it. Right? I used to crack a joke with my high schoolers. I was like, look, if the feds come, we on page 48. Right? If they take me away and I am gone for longer than 3 hours, I have been put into a case of extreme rendition. You know who to call. And they all looked at me like, what? And there was a couple of students like, he talking facts. They might come, right? So when people would come to visit my classroom, they were already attuned to it. It was like, Stovall, is that one of them? They got beef? Is it beef? I was like, nah, y'all, it's cool. It's one of the homies. Okay. Yeah, it's like, okay. They like, okay. They sit down, they still like, okay. Like, I just want, Stovall, we just need you to know that we watching them. Okay, look, they got you in cuffs. We got them things. We ready, right? So this thing around not being fearful, right? Because as soon as you make a stand towards justice, they are coming. Because you are in a situation that will reward you for killing justice. Now, that's kind of funky to say on a Saturday morning. But I have to be honest about this. Because if I'm not honest about this, I'm going to lie to you. Right? And this is not the time to be lying to folks. I live in a city that has depopulated itself of black people. The city of Chicago has lost 250,000 black people since 2000. right? We have a school district where there are buildings that were built for 2,500 students that got 120. We are in a situation where it costs more money to keep the lights on and the heat on in some buildings than it does to pay the staff. So there's no way to keep them open. And this is where we are. And this type of situation that you all are seeing in Las Vegas, in Clark County, is something that we are connected to and seeing across the country. And because we're seeing it in this way, a lot of folks get paranoid about it. And the district response is always to serve you up some neat and fancy lie about it. Some of y'all may have went to this meeting yesterday in Caesar's Palace, right? The Education Summit for the state of Nevada. Right? They probably didn't even tell y'all. Right? And your former mayor, who's now the head of, you got to pay attention to the language, she's the head of the Public Education Fund, right? Not public education, but the people who raise money for public education, who want their names represented on whatever they sponsor. She said it was a challenging year. Now, people get paranoid when somebody comes to the mic and says, no, it was fucked up, right? Not only was it that, it became tragic in some spaces because all COVID did was make us realize that we are in 3 pandemics: white supremacy, capitalism, and COVID-19, right? So now, when we understand that, and the only thing COVID did was heighten what we already were living. It made more people pay attention. And what we saw for the young folks who were the most marginalized in those places, those who have historically had the least got even less. Here in Vegas, Clark County, y'all have families in those library parking lots trying to get Wi-Fi. Y'all have folks who had to line up around the block for schools to get computers because families didn't have one. You've seen this, right? Schools opening up in particular ways just to serve lunch for that hour. We know this. So now, given what we know, what are we willing to do? Now, here's the thing, y'all. Teaching, we always ask these random questions, and you always see this when you go to professional developments. People always say, well, what are best practices? Right? What if I told y'all that ain't it? What we now have to figure out is, what is the relationship that we have to our particular space? What is the relationship that we have to the young folks and families in those communities? And what is it that they have identified that they need that represents a quality education? I guarantee you it will not be schooling. Because many parents just ask you, they want you to love on their son, daughter, niece, nephew, grandbaby. Because they live in a world that reminds them all the time of how much it does not love them. So now, there's no prescription to this fight outside of the idea that it will take you to do collective work. You will have to find the people in your building who know what they do. You will have to build allegiances with them, because that is the only way you will survive this. And I'm saying this not as some expert, somebody who got funky letters behind their name. I'm saying this to you as somebody who is seeing this every day. And in too many instances, we run away from this. And I don't want to lie to y'all, it's tough right now. Real talk, y'all. It is tough. And every day we're reminded of how tough it is. But now, here's where we have to pull from the strength. There are people who have done this before us. What are we willing to do to learn from them? How do we put those things in action that represent what we're trying to do in classrooms? When the enemy comes, how do you prepare for them? Because this isn't trying to make things palpable. This is saying, if I am an educator, I have a responsibility to myself, my students, and their families. That responsibility is going to require me to ask a very different set of questions, because I am constantly reminded of how much schooling takes away from their education. And I might not have a gig after that. Real talk, I don't want to lie about this, man. Like, it's way too serious. And because it is that serious, we now have to begin to think about what is it that we are pulling from. I want to talk real briefly about one revolutionary group that never gets their love. Librarians. Librarians are some of the most revolutionary people for the simple reason of having access to information when folks need it. There's a very interesting story that came out of Vermont in 2001, and it was a little blip in the media. So when the Homeland Security Act was passed, the FBI went to libraries in the Northeast, and they were demanding everybody's library card and information. And they said it was about catching terrorists. This group of 5 librarians in Vermont told the FBI, before you come in here, you better get a warrant. Because we know that the information collected will not be used to, quote unquote, catch terrorists, more so than it will be used to profile people who were just here trying to get information. They went all the way through the Vermont courts. And the courts sided with the librarians. They were brave enough to say, no, get a warrant. They were brave enough to say, look, if you're going to come in here, it's not going to be about victimizing the folks that we care about and the responsibility that we have for them to have access to information, period. So this fight that you're in, it is attacking the historical record. It is saying that you cannot engage any modicum of truth because they're worried about a couple of folks in that district who might feel bad. And the response always has to be, well, if the concern is about people feeling bad or unhearing the truth, what is our expectation if we continue to lie to them? We are in what my uncle refers to as a head and gut moment. You will make a decision in your head, but you will be reminded by your gut. And those two things are very different. And now the work is making the head and gut meet. And it's not easy. Again, I'm not here to lie to y'all. Teaching is real work. It is work that's going to challenge you in very different ways, absent of the attack, absent of this. But now that you're in it, we have some responsibility to be with you, right? This moment is calling for mutual educational aid. We have to be willing to support folks, right? You have to be willing to support each other, because in many of those instances, it will only be the alliances that you have with yourself that will affirm your sanity. So now, how do we do this work intentionally, right? In a way that is unflinching. The historical record reminds us of this. And when we can't say things like race, sexual orientation, gender, class, we're going to have real problems. We have embarked on a revolutionary moment. And I don't say that lightly. And in that revolutionary moment, you will make a decision to either focus or fold. And now it is requiring us to do a different type of work that those good teachers that you had in your experiences were willing to do. It's a little tougher, I won't lie. It's a little harder, but it is even more necessary. We continue to operate these places built on lies and innuendo. We are deserving of a place that reminds us of the necessity of interruption. If something is trash, you should not have to withstand it. We reward young people for surviving school instead of engaging education. So every kindergarten, 8th grade, high school diploma is recognition of your capacity to survive your dehumanization. And my mom was always, damn, baby, why are you so negative? I'm like, hey, look, if we are real, then this is what it is. And she always was like, child, I knew it from day one. The moment you started to crawl, I would put you in one direction and you would always go the opposite. She said, that has come to fruition. 50 years later, you are still doing the same thing. When I got hired, my grandmother said, child, do they know who they hired? I said, no, ma'am. She said, I didn't think so. Because if they did, they probably wouldn't have let you in the building. I said, and then she said, do the work. So that is more than enough, right? The affirmation is more than enough, right? You will see if you stay in this long enough. So my first teaching assignment was 5th grade. My 5th graders are in their 30s now. And I'm like, damn. You know, like when folks go from like 10 to like 30, you know, their faces change. Like, damn, they got babies. I'm like, oh, whoa, right? So this whole thing around looking at folks in this way now calls us in to do something different, because you may not see the results of your teaching until 10 years after you actually taught, right? So now the challenge is, how do we engage in longitudinal work? Longitudinal work is saying this is not in the immediate as much as it is our preparation for what is to come. And you all are in that moment, right? I don't want to lie in front about this, because if we continue to lie in front about this, we're going to be all the worse. And they got you in particular spaces, and I don't want you to be scapegoated, right? So now the thing is, how are we really willing to support each other, right? How do we set up strategies that we are clear about getting what it is that we need? You all know schoolhouses much better than most people. So now in your transition to having classrooms of your own, it's going to call into question all the things that you've seen, and now what are you willing to do different given what it is that you're seeing? And that's different. It takes a little more work. And good teaching is always extra work, right? It's always saying, all right, look, I got to do that. And some days, like my 5th grade classroom, my 5th graders used to tell me, Stovall, you need help. And I couldn't think about them as being disrespectful. I was like, you're right. So now what do I need to do to demonstrate how I have got the assistance that I needed? So every time they told me I needed help, I would go back to them and say, given the fact that you all alerted me that I needed help, this is what I did. I remember one time one of my students said, Stovall, I see that you're learning. Right? And then another one said, good job. Now, then, sometimes they say, will you do it again? Right? Because that's always a reminder, right? It is not that you know, but that you are willing to learn. Teaching is always about learning. So now what is the commitment to learn? And if we're committed to learn, now our work is different. Because now you're willing to say what did not go well and what did go well. And based on what did not go well, what are you willing to do to improve it? Outside of students will be able to. Right? Or your word wall. Or vocabulary time. Right? So now we got to think about this in real time. Because this stuff is coming, right? And it feels like a blitz, right? I mean, you look up and you're saying, what is going on, right? But I understand white supremacy. I expected nothing less. This was just a reminder of America telling us it has been what it says it has been since day one. A place founded on slavery, genocide, and wrongful land appropriation in the form of settler colonialism. Everything done after that has been either in compliance with that or in resistance to it. I am willing to join the resistance, period. Right? And now, when we think about that, what is the future of learning? And you determine that. You also determine right now. And you getting into this, I know many of your friends and family are looking at y'all like, what the hell is wrong with you? What are you doing? Right? Right? They looking at you in the morning saying, are you sure? Right? How many y'all got that friend looking at you in the face? For real? You about to bust up in the classroom straight up? Okay. All right. So now, again, it's on us. Again, I don't make any of these comments as an expert. I make these comments as a struggling educator who's been doing this for 30 years, right? And there has been more failures than there have been successes. But I accept the failure with recognition that this is what must be done. And this is how I believe it. And I cannot do it by myself. It requires me to be in community with folks who understand similar things that I can learn from and use, because we are in a fight. And it is a fight I am trying to win. And I know I cannot win that by myself. So let me end with this. I am quoting the scholar Erica Miners, who quoted the politician Harvey Milk. I am here to recruit you to get in trouble for all the right reasons. Thank y'all. I know we have a couple minutes for Q&A. Okay, cool. So if there are questions that anybody has, I know we got microphones. I got a microphone, and all the situations, or we can briefly engage in a 5-minute staring contest. Whichever one works.
Yes, I'm a sixth and seventh and eighth grade teacher. I teach seventh grade right now, reading and English. And say, for instance, if you're a teacher and the students come to your class and tell you about what's going on, like 31 people was suspended today because they stood up in the lunchroom, and just different things like that. You know, I feel like you can't say anything because they don't, like you said, you fired. You get what I'm saying? Yes. So what would be the method that because I just say, tell your parents. Don't
Right.
tell me.
Right.
That's what I tell the kids. But
Right.
what would you say?
I would double it up, right? So if you're telling them to engage the parents, I would also say, well, look, I would go into that situation a little deeper and say, well, do you know why they were standing up? Right? And then from that conversation, now it gets, and this is a thing around curriculum, right? Because a lot of times, this is why unit plans don't necessarily fit what we can actually do pedagogically, right? But this thing around when we look at that type of figuring out what the situation is, but now having the readings reflect what it is that they're talking about. So curriculum becomes a living document, right? So now we're getting things that actually get them to think about their world and what they're seeing. So if those 31 young folks who got suspended were standing up in some type of protest, the first thing I would think about is the story of a woman named, who at the time was a teenager, named Claudette Colvin. Has anybody heard of Claudette Colvin? Right? And Claudette Colvin is somebody that becomes important. We always think about the Montgomery bus boycott in relationship to Rosa Parks. A full year before Rosa Parks actually designed that, because this is the lie we get, right? We get the lie that Rosa Parks was tired and then she just sat down in the front. Rosa Parks was a field secretary for the NAACP. They had actually orchestrated what they were going to do to start the Montgomery bus boycott. 8 months before that, Claudette Colvin, who had also been in conversation with her students, with her classmates, got on the bus and was like, nah, take me to jail. They didn't, and this was Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Congress of Racial Equity, and the NAACP. They did not want Claudette Colvin to be the representative because she got pregnant at 16. Right? So now, when we start to think about that piece, it's always around whatever is brought to us, what can we pull in? Right? And when they come, as in Chicago we say, when the ops come, first thing we say is, my students were curious about what had actually happened. I don't want to be dismissive of what they're seeing and not put that into a context where we can potentially learn. And because I'm interested in them learning, I gave them a story about Claudette Colvin, who is very rarely discussed. So now it allows us to ask critical questions. My pedagogical approach is centered in critical inquiry. And if we can ask questions of our conditions, we can work with others to change them for the better. And then you say to the op, isn't that what you want? Right? Because what are they going to do, right? They're not going to come at you and say, what's wrong with you? Your students are engaged. They're not going to do that, right? But when they come to class, when they see that everybody is like, oh, and they asking questions like, oh, right? But it's really around how we maneuver that, right? Because this particular attack requires us to maneuver in a particular way, right? But I think that thing around how do we always pull in the thing that connects our students to what it is that they're seeing, right? With the understanding, just like you said, they are going to come, right? But we always, in our heads, that's the first preparation. When they come, we do X. Right? And that thing, I think that thing keeps us safe moving forward. Not as safe maybe as we would like, but safer, because we have demonstrated a commitment to the curricular validity of this, right? If we call it that, right? But really being able to put that back on folks and saying, look, I want students to be able to engage their world, right? And if we are intentional about them engaging their world, then what better place than a space about reading, right? So it's always how our content informs our actions. Yeah. Mm-hmm. They're telling me that time is up. Appreciate y'all. Look.